All right, now we're going. All right, Dr. Nettles is, because I love doing, I said at the last meeting, is fulfilling my fantasy of being a judge, so. Okay. Thank you for indulging me. Call the meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. We are, the first item on the agenda is an opportunity for any member of the committee to declare a conflict of interest. If one exists, is there any conflict of interest that any member of the committee needs to make us aware of? Okay, hearing none. I'd ask Dr. Nettles if you do not mind reading the NGH mission statement and vision, please.
Gladly. To improve the health and wellness of Nashville by providing equitable access to coordinated patient-centered care, supporting tomorrow's caregivers, and translating science into clinical practice.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nettles. At this point, we have an opportunity for any member of the public who wants to make comments and has the opportunity to decide. Is there anyone who wants to make comments?
No, sir.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Lester. Before we get to the rest of the substantive items on the agenda, I want to invite the members of the committee and all those attending to please help yourself to lunch. Once again, the hospital has provided us a delicious lunch, contrary to all false characterizations of hospital food. We have been enjoying really wonderful food at all of our meetings today. We have a pasta bar with grilled chicken, a separate salad, and so once again, thanks to the hospital for making that available to us, and to attendees at our meeting. Please feel free, members of the committee and others, to eat while we go through our business. First action item is the approval of the minutes from our last meeting. Those have been circulated to you for review. Are there any, before we vote, are there any edits or changes that anyone on the committee would like to make to the minutes of our previous meeting? If not, I'll entertain a motion to adopt the minutes of our last meeting.
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second? Second. Thank you. So there's a motion and a second to adopt the minutes. Any discussion? All those in favor of approving our previous minutes say aye. Any opposed? Minutes are approved. We do not have any old business on our agenda, and so we'll move to the new business. And the first item on our agenda is to receive a report from Metro Legal. You'll recall that at our last meeting, we asked Metro Legal to conduct an inquiry into the status of the previous RFP, the process by which we had an executive search firm on call, and whether whether that there was a process in place that we could use to rely on that, or if not, their advice as to whether we need to proceed with a competitive solicitation for a search firm. So Matthew Garth is here from Metro Legal, and I think prepared to advise the committee about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the Metro Legal Department's recommendation is for the contract for an executive search firm to go through a competitive bidding process. We looked at the prior contract, and it never went through a competitive bidding process. There were several proposals that were received, and those proposals were taken to the board, but it did not go through competitive bidding as is required under state law. We also looked to see if there were any other potential pathways where the contract would not have to actually go through the procurement process again. This particular vendor does not have any other contracts with any local government entities in Tennessee, and this type of contract is not a professional services contract such that it would not have to go through competitive bidding. It doesn't meet the requirements for that under state law. So it's the recommendation of legal that this contract be put through the competitive bidding process.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Garth. Are there any questions or comments that committee or others have about that report and the recommendation from Metro Legal? Yes, Dr. Martin.
I think that the
board and the committee has felt that it's ideal to have a search firm. There is possibly another path that could be taken and would not necessarily exclude a search firm. And something we need to deal with anyway, which is the fact that we have at least 4 strong candidates who have come forward, who are kind of waiting to hear, when can they be interviewed and considered. And some, at least 1 or 2 of whom probably, with the extension of this process, will find another job somewhere else. So I wonder if it's possible to proceed with the bidding for a search firm, but also get to know some of these candidates that have already expressed an interest. Don't know the answer to that, and I'm not necessarily recommending it. I'm just saying that we may lose some good candidates by prolonging the process. It's estimated by AMN that it would take about 6 months to have somebody in place. So this may put it out to 8 or 9 months. I don't know.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. I think, Dr. Nettles, you wanted to say something, and also if the committee wants to address this idea of simultaneous search firm and sort of directly engaging candidates that have expressed interest now.
Well, my comment is that I'm really glad it was confirmed that this is the due diligence that we should do, that we have found out what is the most appropriate and also the most beneficial way to conduct this. So I feel comfortable in that, very comfortable. In fact, I'm very glad about that. And so I do agree with Dr. Martin's comments to a point where it's been my experience in healthcare profession is that it is one of those organizations that takes a long time to get people. I mean, a really long time. It is not the average world, and that's for many, many reasons. And so I am very comfortable with that. With that said, that it also allows us to broaden our horizons, given the type of vision that we're looking at in the next 5 to 10 years. I just think that this is a wonderful opportunity to move forward in expanding the search process.
Great, thank you.
I'm also glad to receive clarity because I think that was a concern for all of us at the last meeting, and we want to make sure that we're doing this the right way. I also have had, like probably all of us have had people who have approached us or at least wanted to submit their name, and I haven't actually gotten to the point where I would have talked to them directly and specifically about kind of their time frame at this point, but I guess I was trying to think about the other shoe to drop too, which is there might be people out there that are equally as good of a candidate that might not be available today, that may be available in 6 months or 9 months from now. So I guess I would also want to be thoughtful about providing a fair and balanced platform and time frame for everyone. So I feel like there might be conversation again. I'm just throwing this out there too to think through. Would there be an opportunity for bias or more consideration for a candidate that we have known longer and or had a deeper contact with, rather than having everybody as a slate come forward at the same time? I don't know that. I'm just saying, and Dr. Martin maybe address that mindset, but I just would want an equal playing field across all candidates. And so that would be the only hesitation in terms of moving forward. And then who would be in charge of that if we don't have a search firm yet? And then again, if that is a voting member of either our board and or this committee, does that present unnatural bias? So that I just want to throw that out there as kind of a process question rather than an individual person question, because I know you and many people who are doctors here have unbelievably great connections and probably know a lot more about who is out there and available. So I respect that as well. Thanks.
I just want to say that with the legal feedback from Metro Legal and the motion that the board passed that we talked about at the last meeting that was asking for the highest level of transparency, going through this process, even though it will take longer, I think will assuage everyone's concern that the highest level of transparency is being followed.
I agree with Ms. Smith and what everybody has said here. I think we do need to consider there are a lot of decisions to be made about the future of the hospital, and some we've talked about. Well, we should wait until there's a new person on board to be in charge about current personnel and operations, for one thing, about renewal of the lease of this building, about whether it's appropriate to build a new building, about moving forward with a study of the needs, medical needs of Nashville. So I'm just trying to balance, I wish we could get the right, perfect person in place within a few months so we could move ahead with those things. So that's really my main reason for bringing it up. I hope that we don't just tread water, for the next 9 to 12 months as we go through this process.
Well, as far as from my perspective, I feel as if that I owe the community, when I say the community, that we have made, or at least looked at, all possibility, or as many possibilities out there as whatever. And at the same time, we're in great shape. I think Dr. Elders is doing a tremendous job. That's part and parcel of everything. But I think that given the history, that I need to say that, yes, we have gone beyond and also gotten the recommendation that this is the right thing to do. And it doesn't have to be drawn out. We don't have to be treading water. We have to be very vigilant. We have to be very aggressive, very active. We have to use our time wisely, and it can be done. So, and I'm very confident that that can happen. So I think that nothing will slow down. It's just that we have more information. We will definitely have informed consent. As far as I'm concerned, you want to make sure you know what's out there. That's all I'm saying.
I would largely echo that and other comments committee members have made. I think that there's an equity component to making sure that we, cast a broad net, and give sort of equal opportunity for people. And it may mean that people who are in a hurry, to make a decision on this are not on our timeline. The other thing, so I agree with that. I also think that there is real value in this process for us as a committee, as a board, as a hospital, to use this time to examine what are the qualities that we want in the next leader. I'm not sure, as we sit here right now, we can interview people next week. And I would feel like if I were conducting that interview, I don't have a sense from our stakeholders, from our partners, from the board, from the community, what are the priorities and the things that we're looking for in that leader. And it's important to me to have a process where we are very firm in our minds as a committee and as a board and as an institution as to who exactly we are looking for. So I think there's a prior question in my mind. At the same time, I recognize that there are some urgent decisions that are going to have to be made that are big decisions, like the lease of the facility itself and the antiquated nature of it that seems to be what everyone agrees is the state of things. And so we have an interim CEO, but we need to make some long-term decisions perhaps in the next year. So that is just a tension that we are going to have to navigate. And it may be that we can put some of those decisions off because it's important for whoever the new leader is to have a real stake in that. Or it may be that the interim CEO is going to have to start down that path because those decisions cannot wait. So I appreciate that that's, somewhat of a tension, but I do think it's worth making sure that this process is done, in a way that is fair to all potential candidates, and also builds the kind of consensus that we need for our next leader to be effective. So I guess sort of the decision before the committee, which I don't think is an action item, although Mr. Garth can correct me, is we as a committee don't authorize the issuance of an RFP. That's an operational thing that happens. So I guess, one, the consensus of the committee, and can correct me if I'm wrong, is that we are going to follow Metro Legal's recommendation and conduct a competitive solicitation for an executive search firm. Let me know if I'm mistaken about any of that.
Do we need a motion for that?
We can entertain a motion that the will of the committee is to do a competitive solicitation to hire an executive search firm.
So moved.
All right, move. Is there a second?
Second.
Ms. Smith, thank you. There's a motion and a second. Any discussion? All those in favor of the motion say aye. Aye. Any opposed? I guess the other thing is to address Dr. Martin's suggestion about conducting a parallel interview process for people who have currently expressed interest. And I do think we as a committee ought to decide whether we want to engage those people or have that fold into the eventual search firm. I take it from the committee's comments and Dr. Martin, let us know if you have disagree or think we ought to pursue a different path, but I take it from the tenor of the comments that we want to have existing candidates go through the process that all the other candidates would go through.
No, I agree that is the consensus of the group. I do think we have to talk about how we communicate with the people who are waiting to hear.
Right, yeah, I mean, as Ms. Smith said, a number of people have indicated to us individually and more formally that they are interested in this position. And you're right, we should communicate to all those people where we are in the process and that we will be hiring a search firm that will conduct this search on our behalf and working with us. And we're not going to be doing interviews or making that selection until we get that consulting group in place.
May I make a suggestion that you as chair of our committee be the person responsible for the language and emails directly back to these individuals? I absolutely agree, Dr. Martin, the respect that we show these candidates, I think will go a long way in terms of our professionalism and also their interest in even being a part of this search. So I think that they deserve that answer. And so maybe the coordination between Ms. Lester and David, you as our chair, can work to make sure that you are the conduit by which all information is provided, both given and received. So that takes us all as board members and as a committee out of that loop, and it's one voice speaking on behalf of our board. I think that's the right thing to do, and it's consistent language. And you're an attorney, so that works just well for me.
I use words a lot in my job. I am happy to do that,
So do
Dr.
I, but
Martin.
people don't appreciate it the same way.
I absolutely agree with that, and I think that any of us who are contacted should refer the questions to you.
I would be happy to do that, and I absolutely, I'm glad that you've made this suggestion, because the people who have approached us are people who are would very likely make great CEOs of the hospital, and that may be the case, and we owe them the respect to let them know where we are in our process, and I will absolutely do that.
Also, I think that this letter and the response sets the tone and the expectations and the uniqueness of this search, that we are a safety net hospital. We are driven by different constraints other than, other standalone or private hospitals or what have you. But so it is very different. And so
Yes.
just to put that in there, I want to make sure
That does
it's
make
unique.
it makes the search process unique as well. Thank you, Dr. Nettles. I also think that is a good segue to when we eventually have a search firm that conducts this search on our behalf and with us, which is, again, from sort of the equity perspective, that rather than at that point, all communications would go to the search firm, and reduces the opportunity for any of us who have individual relationships with any candidate. I assume, based on experience with prior search firms like this, that when we engage someone, we will direct any inquiries to the board or to the organization, to the firm. And that way, there's no question that this is a process to which every person has equal participation, and knowing somebody on the board doesn't give you an in that other people do not have, to put it very bluntly. Okay, very good. So in anticipation of what Metro Legal has recommended to us, I'm happy to report on the not just sort of waiting around, that this is in motion. We have had a meeting with the Metro Procurement. Metro Procurement has received a copy of a draft request for proposal, which is the vehicle to conduct the solicitation that the hospital has put together. Thank you, Diana, for getting that over. So we already have a draft of this that Metro Procurement is reviewing and going to give us their comments. They have asked us for names of search firms that we think ought to be advised of this opportunity. And Ms. Smith has provided me with some names that I have forwarded. I'd invite any other members of the committee who have search firms that they know are skilled in this area or have abilities in the area of healthcare executive level searches. We will provide as many candidates as possible, because part of this process is Metro and the hospital will advise anyone who we think is a candidate to participate in this, to invite them to participate. So one question that came up that I would appreciate, while we have some time, the committee's consideration is, we are now focused on the search for a CEO. There are many times where there are executive level searches or that need to happen for the hospital aside from the CEO search. And in fact, with B.E. Smith/AMN, we have used their services a number of times over the last several years for those types of searches. So one question for the committee, for input, I think eventually Metro Procurement and Hospital Procurement will recommend or make this decision as a procurement matter. But do we intend the RFP to be for executive search firm capabilities generally, and the first instance of that will be the CEO search? Or do we conduct a procurement that is very limited to a firm to conduct this particular search? I'd be interested in committee's thoughts on that.
It would seem to cast a wider net, makes sense. But I guess the question I would have with regard to the search firm, are there distinctions in search firms where their highest and best use is with maybe only a CEO or maybe CEO, CFO, COO combination, but yet they can scale to the director? I don't know the answer. And that's a first question in terms of a very niche specialty. And then the second question I would have would be, does that in any way delay our process by evaluation of other options comparative to one specific piece that we're looking for. So, and cost, obviously, does that expand our cost? So those are three things that quickly come to mind with regard to looking at other, expanding that beyond the CEO.
And I mean, it's very appealing that we would have to go, if we want to do a search next year for something else, that we'd already have somebody in place. But, you know, who knows, the pricing might be different. So, I mean, one question, we were working under the assumption that we had a contract with AMN and that we could use that for different positions. So if it's possible to, for this bidding process to be specific for the CEO, if it would be possible then to say a year from now, we already have a contract, we bid out a search firm, now we're going to use them for a CFO, CMO, whatever. Because I'm like you, I would like to, for this to be very specific. I think it might be faster, and it might be, you know, we could negotiate specifically the cost better if we're specific. But if we can use that contract to say, okay, we don't need to bid it out next time, it'd be ideal.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Guest mic. Thank you.
Hi, Donna Wolfert. Yes, I believe that if we provide this RFP and find a search firm that is an executive search firm, we can create with them a master service agreement instead of just specific to the CEO. And that MSA has the ability for us to have an overarching agreement to be able then to search out other executives if they so have the ability to do that. Most of the time, whether it's AMN B. Smith or Whitkeefer or those search firms, they usually do C-suite, especially and specialize in hospitals. So if we can get an MSA with them and not just specific to the CEO search, I believe we can absolutely do what you just asked. I'll defer to Metro, but I'm pretty sure that's how it works.
I think that's right. I also wonder whether on cost we're gonna get a better cost proposal if a firm knows that it is an ongoing relationship. A one-off, I would assume, is priced higher than it is if a firm understands that this is maybe the first of what are multiple things that would result, I would hope, in that more advantageous pricing for us.
And then the board needs to be aware that most searches are conducted based on factors and including the final package and the salary. So anytime we do that, that has effect. So one search might be, the CEO search might be, the expense might be different than another executive based on that final package. Just wanted to remind them, you guys, about that as well.
Any other thoughts on the sort of the scope of the RFP? Sounds like we don't want to slow it down, but if other things being equal, we proceed with the same pace, we would prefer to have the option to go back to this search firm and not have to conduct an RFP for each individual executive search we want to do. The other thing to think about then is that it doesn't require a decision now, but this process is going to involve an evaluation committee. So there needs to be a group of people who will receive the proposals, who will score them in one way or another, or otherwise, I should say score is probably too specific, who will evaluate the proposals and then make the determination of who is the winner. I think it's important that more than one person from our committee, though we have to think about how we do this consistent with public meeting laws, but because we are going to be working so closely with this firm, need to figure out a way to have representation as a part of the evaluation team of this group, but also if it is an ongoing relationship, people in the hospital like Diana and others on her team who are going to be working with the firm day to day. So I just throw that out there. If there's comment now or for just reflection, because we're not to this point yet, but think about what we think the composition of the evaluation team should look like. Appreciate people's thoughts on that.
The only RFP we've done that I'm aware of in the last few years had to do with our marketing firm and the way it worked. And in this case, Kathy Poole sort of ran the show and got the bids, and the staff then presented to the board 3 different companies and which one that they recommended. And one question would be, is it appropriate for this committee to ultimately choose the firm, or is that, like all other contracts, a board decision? And that would be a real time sensitive thing, because that could cost us some more time. I'm assuming the board would need to approve with the recommendation of this committee, but a lot of the legwork could be done by the staff who would then present it to us. The other way to look at it is that we appoint a subcommittee to be in charge of that will have to do it in public meetings.
I think you're right that eventually, because of the size of this contract, it would have to come to the board for a vote. So whatever this procurement process results in, the recommendation of the award would have to be approved by the board. And the legwork that you talk about is definitely going to be done by staff. Procurement specialists at Metro and within the hospital are going to create the proposal. They're going to submit the proposal. They're going to gather they're going to field questions from bidders. There's a whole process. The evaluation team, of which I think, at least one person from this committee should be a part of, is reviews and evaluates, but that's a small part of the overall process. For sure, we will be depending on staff to conduct the vast majority of this process.
I think that we should also, I think to your point about the previous RFP with the marketing, that was done mainly internally by, I think, different department heads and mainly staff. I do think this process is a little different because it is ultimately people choosing the company that chooses the head of the hospital. I'm not sure if there's ways to divide up into different groups that ultimately submit. As an example, you would be part of Group A. Dr. Nettles might be part of Group B. So you're meeting with other people, but not together. And then that information can be compiled and then funneled back through this committee and then ultimately to the board. So I do feel like having a reasonable footprint in that process, though, would be important, especially from an evaluation. I would not want to personally lean on staff or ELT specifically, quite frankly, to bring to this committee the individual who or company that they would recommend to hire the CEO. I think that is a very important piece that this committee has been tasked to do. And so if there's a way from a legal perspective to make sure that could be divided up or sectioned off in appropriate rooms, even, moving from room to room in terms of interviews or however that's done, where we're not physically maybe sitting in the same space, maybe that can be done. So let's think through that, lean on Metro Legal, but I definitely want to make sure that we have our footprint on that piece.
That is probably a question for some further research to see. I just want to make sure, we're keeping in mind Open Meetings Act, and then also just your role on the board and what you'll eventually take up versus your involvement in the sort of the process of selecting just balancing those two things and thinking through it. But I'll probably have to have some further research to be able to advise on that. But.
Well, I think the sentiment is for the research and for us to work through how it happens is that because of how closely this committee is going to work with a search firm to select our new CEO, it's really important that the members of the committee feel comfortable with this firm. I take from your comments, Christy, that right if we are absent from this process and the board votes on a recommended search firm that none of us, have confidence in, we are doomed from the start. So we have to have buy-in because of the nature of our role. And so the overall charge to Metro Legal and to us is to figure out how to make that happen. And we have to figure out how to make that happen. Okay. Thank you for the input. I will say, given where we are and that there are some, details, procedural things, documents to draft, we may get to the point over the next month or so where our every other week meeting schedule is not needed. That's a schedule that I anticipated we were like in the midst of conducting the search. This procurement process is going to take several months to see all the way through. And so I'll just be on the lookout for notice that we may not need to meet 2 weeks from now or a month from now. I'm not exactly sure, but as we hear from procurement folks at Metro and here, we'll know better what our role is. But there may not be anything for us to do and any action items for us as a committee. We will keep it going, but be on the lookout that we may not need to meet to for every other week during this part. Okay. All right, our next meeting date tentatively is May 28th, but be on the lookout. I will remind everyone that there's delicious pasta that has been provided by the hospital. Please partake. Yes? Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Oh, my goodness. There's an entire agenda item. Thank you for reminding me that I was about to bypass one of our agenda items. Thank you for those. We in our last meeting, we asked for input on stakeholders who ought to be involved in this process, and we received, and you got from Ms. Lester, the input from various members of the committee. I guess at this point, I would invite, if people have any discussion or any further names or categories of people that they want to add to that list, now is a good opportunity to do that.
Is the request for specific names or for
The request
categories?
is more by category, yeah. What are the constituencies in the community that we want to make sure are involved in this search and selection process? I don't know if you have seen.
I have not
okay,
seen
all right.
any of this. No.
Okay, the members of the committee got by email the compilation, and Ms. Lester, if you can share that, okay, is going to provide that. And so we have a list now. I think the ultimate recipient of this list is the search firm. That very early on, we will say, here's the will of the committee and the board as to the kinds of people that we need their input. And so I don't think there's an urgency to that, but I'm glad that we have that list, and we certainly want to keep adding to it.
Yes, I'd certainly like to see the list,
Okay.
and I'll be happy to. Probably everybody I'll think of is already on it, but I'll be happy to add any that.
Yeah, we would welcome that. Thank you. All right.
I think from the last meeting, it was just the focus on sectors rather than names, just because we didn't want to vet the names in a public setting and then obviously be disclosing our relationships personally. And then, quite frankly, talking about whether or not we personally as a committee thought someone would be a good fit. I just feel like that gets uncomfortable and potentially improper. So I think having those conversations about the categories of people and what that looks like as a more comfortable place from a open meetings setting, and then to Mr. Esquivel's point, that way we can hand this list to the search firm. Then individually as board members and committee members, we can say, hey, here's who, Dr. Martin feels like might be a good fit for these categories. So I think that is a better jumping off point rather than me throwing out a name and us going, well, I don't really like that guy. I don't like that gal. She didn't pick up her trash a lot, and, whatever that is. So I think this is a better solution and more appropriate for this type of meeting.
Thank you, Janet, for circulating. You all now have the in hard copy the list that we have going of by category of the stakeholders that we think are important to include as part of this process. So thank you for those of you who have done that and invite others to contribute.
I'd like to say that I will be contributing. This was on my list of things to do, but I will get this to you all ASAP.
Great, thank you. And as I said, that's at your. It would be great to get it soon, so we have that, and then we will put this aside and plan to share it with our executive search firm when they are in place, because this will be the start of the process. Any further business from anyone on the committee? If not, is there a motion to adjourn our meeting? Thank you. Any second? All right, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much. Enjoy your lunch and the rest of your afternoon.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.